The rain had started just after midnight, falling slowly over the quiet town of Brookdale as if the sky itself were tired. Most people were asleep, their houses dark and peaceful, but inside a small police station on Maple Street, the lights were still on. Detective Alan Pierce sat alone at his desk, staring at a thin folder that did not look important at first glance. Inside it was a name he had seen many times before over the years: Daniel Harper. 30 years earlier, Daniel had been arrested for the murder of a local shop owner, a crime that had shocked the entire town. The evidence back then seemed clear, the trial had been quick, and the verdict had come without hesitation. Guilty. Life in prison. Over time, people stopped talking about the case. New families moved into Brookdale, old memories faded, and Daniel Harper became just another forgotten prisoner somewhere behind tall gray walls. But tonight something was different. Earlier that evening, a young journalist named Lily Carter had walked into the station holding a worn notebook and a quiet determination that immediately caught Alan's attention. She explained that she had been researching old court cases for a series of articles and had come across Daniel's trial. At first it seemed ordinary, but the more she read, the more strange details she noticed: missing reports, unclear witness statements, and a timeline that did not seem to fit together properly. Alan had almost dismissed it as curiosity, the kind journalists often had, but Lily showed him one small piece of information that made his heart beat a little faster: a witness statement that had never been presented in court. According to that statement, someone else had been seen near the shop the night of the murder. Someone who was never questioned. Now, as the rain tapped gently against the window, Alan turned the page again and again, wondering how something so important could have disappeared for 3 decades. Somewhere far away, in a quiet prison cell where the nights felt longer than the days, Daniel Harper was lying awake on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling the same way he had done thousands of nights before. After 30 years, he had almost stopped hoping that the world outside still remembered him. But in Brookdale, on this quiet rainy night, a forgotten story had just begun to wake up. Morning arrived slowly in Brookdale, the rain replaced by a pale gray sky that seemed unsure whether it wanted to become a sunny day or remain quiet and cloudy. Inside the police station, Detective Alan Pierce had not slept much. The folder about Daniel Harper stayed on his desk all night, open to the same page Lily Carter had shown him. The more he looked at it, the more uncomfortable he felt. 30 years earlier, Alan had been a young officer, new to the job and eager to prove himself. He remembered the night of the murder clearly: flashing police lights outside the small grocery store, worried neighbors gathering in the street, and Daniel Harper standing nearby, confused and frightened as officers questioned him. Daniel had worked as a mechanic in town, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. When the police discovered that he had argued with the shop owner a few days before the murder, suspicion quickly grew around him. One witness said they had seen someone with Daniel's jacket near the store that night. Another person claimed Daniel had left his house late in the evening. Piece by piece, the story formed until it seemed complete, and once the trial began, few people doubted the conclusion. Yet now, reading the forgotten witness statement, Alan noticed something strange: the description of the person near the store did not fully match Daniel at all. The witness had mentioned a tall man with a limp. Someone walking quickly down the street just minutes before the police arrived. Daniel Harper had never had a limp. Alan leaned back in his chair, feeling a quiet weight in his chest. Had everyone simply ignored that detail? Or had it been lost somewhere in the paperwork of a busy investigation? Across the country, inside the aging walls of North Valley Prison, Daniel Harper woke up the same way he did every day, before the guards called for breakfast. The cell was silent except for distant footsteps echoing through the hallway. At 58 years old, Daniel moved more slowly than he once had, but his routine was steady: wash his face, fold his blanket, sit for a moment on the edge of the bed. 30 years had taught him patience, though hope had become a fragile thing. Many inmates talked about appeals and lawyers, but Daniel had stopped expecting change long ago. Still, on this quiet morning, he felt an unusual restlessness he could not explain, as if somewhere far away, something small had begun to move, like the first turning of a key in a very old lock. Later that afternoon, Lily Carter sat in a quiet corner of Brookdale's small public library, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and dusty files that smelled faintly of paper and time. The library was nearly empty, and the soft ticking of a wall clock filled the room as she carefully turned each fragile page. The case of Daniel Harper had begun as a simple research project for her article series about forgotten trials, but the more she read, the more a strange feeling grew inside her. The story written in the newspapers from 30 years ago sounded certain and confident, as if there had never been any doubt about Daniel's guilt. Headlines used strong words like clear evidence and quick justice. Yet the deeper Lily looked, the more the details began to shift slightly, like shadows moving in soft light. One article briefly mentioned that a passerby had reported seeing another man near the grocery store shortly before the crime, but the story never appeared again in later reports. Another note described a broken streetlight near the shop that night, meaning the area had been darker than the police originally believed. Lily quietly copied these details into her notebook, her handwriting slow and careful. She wasn't trying to prove anything yet, she simply wanted to understand what had really happened. Meanwhile, Detective Alan Pierce was sitting in his car outside the same grocery store, which had long since been replaced by a small cafe with bright windows and outdoor tables. Brookdale had changed over the years, but Alan could still picture the old building clearly in his mind. He stepped out of the car and walked slowly along the sidewalk, trying to remember the night of the murder as accurately as possible. The street felt calm now, filled with the gentle sounds of afternoon conversations and distant traffic, but Alan imagined the flashing lights, the voices, the tension of that long-ago investigation. When he reached the corner of the street, he suddenly noticed something he had never thought about before. The angle of the road meant that anyone leaving the store quickly could disappear around the corner within seconds. Hidden from view. If someone else had truly been there that night, it would have been very easy to escape unnoticed. Alan stood quietly for a moment, looking down the street as a light breeze moved through the trees. For the first time in 30 years, a simple but powerful question entered his mind: what if Daniel Harper had never been the right man at all? 2 days later, a quiet afternoon sunlight rested gently over North Valley Prison, warming the tall concrete walls that surrounded the old building. Inside, the atmosphere was calm in the slow way prisons often are, where time seemed to move differently from the outside world. Daniel Harper sat at a small metal table in the visitation room, his hands folded together as he waited. Visitors were rare for him now. In the early years after his conviction, a few friends and distant relatives had come to see him, promising they believed in his innocence. But as the years passed and life continued outside those prison walls, the visits slowly stopped. Daniel had learned not to expect anyone anymore. So when a guard had told him earlier that morning that someone had asked to speak with him, he had felt both curiosity and quiet caution. A few minutes later, the door opened, and a young woman stepped into the room carrying a notebook. She looked around briefly before walking toward the table with a calm but determined expression. "Mr. Harper?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "My name is Lily Carter," she continued, sitting down across from him. "I'm a journalist. I've been researching your case." Daniel studied her face for a moment, as if trying to decide whether this conversation would bring anything new or simply reopen old memories he had spent years learning to carry. "People have researched my case before," he said gently. "Nothing ever changed." Lily nodded slowly, understanding the quiet weight behind his words. "I know," she replied. "But I found something that may have been overlooked." She opened her notebook and showed him a copy of the forgotten witness statement, the one describing a tall man with a limp leaving the area near the grocery store the night of the murder. Daniel read the page carefully, his eyes moving slowly across the lines. When he finished, he looked up with a thoughtful expression that was difficult to read. "I remember telling the police that someone else had been outside the store when I arrived," he said quietly. "But they said the witnesses only saw me." Lily leaned forward slightly. "This statement suggests otherwise," she said. For a moment neither of them spoke. Around them, other visitors quietly talked with inmates, their voices soft and distant. Daniel finally placed the paper back on the table. For 30 years he had carried the heavy silence of a story that no one wanted to hear. Now, sitting across from this determined young journalist, he felt something unfamiliar begin to return, a feeling so small he almost didn't recognize it anymore. Hope. That evening, Brookdale's police station was unusually quiet, with only the soft hum of fluorescent lights filling the hallways. Detective Alan Pierce sat alone in the records room, surrounded by tall metal shelves packed with boxes of old case files that had not been opened for years. The air smelled faintly of dust and paper, and every movement sent tiny particles floating through the light. In front of him lay the original investigation file from the Daniel Harper case, thicker than he remembered but strangely incomplete. Alan carefully turned each page, moving slowly so he would not miss even the smallest detail. 30 years earlier, the investigation had seemed straightforward. The shop owner, Thomas Wheeler, had been found late at night behind the counter of his grocery store. The cash register was open, but only a small amount of money was missing. At the time, the police believed the argument between Wheeler and Daniel Harper had turned violent, and the case quickly focused on Daniel as the main suspect. But now, reading the documents with fresh eyes, Alan noticed how many assumptions had been made during those early days. The witness who claimed to see Daniel near the store had been standing far down the street, nearly half a block away. The description of the jacket, dark and heavy, could have matched dozens of people in town during that cold autumn night. Even more troubling was something Alan had never questioned before, the timeline of events. According to the police report, Daniel had been seen leaving his home at around 10:15 p.m., and the murder was estimated to have happened around 10:30. But the grocery store was nearly 20 minutes away on foot. Alan leaned back in his chair, slowly realizing that the timeline itself might never have made sense at all. At that same moment, across town, Lily Carter sat in her small apartment reviewing the notes she had taken during her visit with Daniel Harper. She had expected anger or bitterness from a man who had spent 30 years in prison, but instead Daniel had spoken with a calm honesty that stayed in her mind long after the meeting ended. One thing he had said continued to echo in her thoughts: "I went to the store because I saw the lights still on. I thought Mr. Wheeler had forgotten to close." If that was true, Daniel might not have been the attacker at all, he might have simply arrived at the worst possible moment. As Lily closed her notebook and looked out the window at the quiet town streets, both she and Detective Alan Pierce were beginning to realize the same unsettling truth: the story everyone had believed for 30 years might have been built on a mistake. The next morning arrived with a soft golden sunlight spreading across Brookdale, gently warming the quiet streets as the town slowly woke up. Detective Alan Pierce had already been awake for hours, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. In front of him were several photocopies from the old case file, including the witness statement Lily had discovered. The description of the tall man with a limp had begun to occupy his thoughts more and more. 30 years ago, that detail had been treated as unimportant, almost like a passing comment that no one needed to investigate further. But now Alan wondered how such a specific description could have been ignored so easily. Determined to learn more, he drove to the home of Margaret Lewis, the woman who had written the statement all those years ago. She had been a young mother at the time, walking home from a late shift at a nearby restaurant when she noticed someone leaving the area near the grocery store. When Alan knocked on the door, it took a few moments before it slowly opened. Margaret was now an elderly woman with gentle eyes and silver hair, but when Alan explained why he had come, she immediately remembered the night he was talking about. "I always wondered why no one asked me more about it," she said quietly as they sat in her living room. "I told the officer what I saw, but after that I never heard anything again." Alan listened carefully as she described the scene from her memory. "The man had been tall," she said, wearing a dark coat and walking quickly down the street with an uneven step, as if one leg bothered him. She remembered the limp clearly because it had caught her attention under the dim streetlights. "Did you recognize him?" Alan asked gently. Margaret shook her head. "No, but I remember thinking he didn't look like Daniel Harper at all. I had seen Daniel around town before, and he walked normally." Alan felt a quiet chill move through him. If this memory was accurate, then someone else had been near the store shortly before the police arrived. Someone who had never been questioned. Meanwhile, miles away inside North Valley Prison, Daniel Harper spent the morning in the prison workshop repairing small mechanical parts, a task he had done for years with steady patience. He had no way of knowing that outside those prison walls, a forgotten memory from an old witness was slowly beginning to reopen the door to the truth. That same afternoon, Lily Carter and Detective Alan Pierce met at a small cafe that now stood where the old grocery store once had been. Through the wide windows they could see the quiet street where the events of 30 years ago had unfolded, though today the town looked peaceful and ordinary. Lily placed her notebook on the table as Alan told her about his visit with Margaret Lewis and the description she had repeated so clearly: the tall man with a limp walking quickly away from the store that night. For a moment Lily said nothing, simply writing down every detail while her mind moved quickly through the information she had gathered during her research. Then she slowly turned a page in her notebook and showed Alan a short list of names. "These are people who were mentioned in early reports about the case but were never interviewed again," she explained. Alan looked down the list carefully. Most of the names were familiar from Brookdale's past: shop owners, delivery drivers, people who had lived in the area at the time. But one name made him pause. Robert Fallon. Alan leaned back slightly in his chair as a distant memory returned to him. Fallon had once been a delivery driver who brought supplies to several stores in town, including the grocery shop owned by Thomas Wheeler. Alan remembered that Fallon had been involved in a minor accident years before the murder, an incident that had left him with a permanent injury to his leg. A limp. Alan looked up at Lily, and for a moment they both understood the same possibility without saying it aloud. "Do we know where he is now?" Alan asked quietly. Lily nodded. "I checked public records this morning," she said. "He moved away from Brookdale a few years after the trial. But he's still alive." The cafe around them was filled with the gentle sounds of afternoon conversations and the quiet clinking of coffee cups, yet at their table the atmosphere had suddenly become very still. If Robert Fallon truly had been near the store that night, the entire case against Daniel Harper could begin to fall apart. But proving something after 30 years would not be easy. Across the country, inside his quiet prison cell, Daniel Harper sat on his narrow bed reading an old paperback novel, unaware that somewhere far away his name was being spoken again, not as a criminal this time, but as a man whose story might finally be about to change. A few days later, Lily Carter found herself sitting beside Detective Alan Pierce in a quiet train carriage moving steadily through the countryside. Outside the window, fields and small towns passed slowly beneath a calm afternoon sky, but neither of them paid much attention to the view. Their thoughts were focused on the same destination, a small town nearly 300 miles away where Robert Fallon had been living for many years. The information Lily had found through public records showed that Fallon had worked at several warehouses over the decades before eventually retiring. His life appeared ordinary, almost quiet, with nothing that suggested any connection to a violent crime long ago. Yet the detail about his injured leg continued to stand out in Alan's mind. If Fallon had truly been the man seen leaving the store that night, it raised an important question that had remained unanswered for 30 years. Why had he been there at all? Lily flipped slowly through her notebook, reviewing everything they knew so far. The timeline of the crime no longer fit Daniel Harper's movements. The witness had clearly seen someone else leaving the scene, and now there was finally a name that matched the description. Still, Lily understood that suspicion alone would not be enough to reopen such an old case. They needed something stronger, something that could finally connect the forgotten details into a clear story. "Do you think he'll talk to us?" Lily asked quietly as the train continued its steady rhythm along the tracks. Alan considered the question carefully. "Sometimes people carry secrets for a long time," he said. "And sometimes those secrets become heavier than they expect." He looked out the window for a moment before continuing. 30 years is a long time to live with something. Late that evening, the train finally arrived at their destination. The town was smaller than Brookdale, with quiet streets and warm lights glowing in the windows of houses along the main road. According to the address they had found, Robert Fallon lived in a modest home near the edge of town. As Lily and Alan walked slowly up the narrow path toward the front door, a cool evening breeze moved through the trees around them. For 30 years the truth about what happened in Brookdale had remained hidden somewhere in the past. Now, standing on the small porch of that quiet house, they were only one conversation away from possibly hearing it at last. The porch light above the door flickered softly as Lily Carter knocked, the quiet sound echoing through the still evening air. For a moment nothing happened, and the street remained silent except for the distant hum of a passing car. Then slow footsteps approached from inside the house, and the door opened just a little. An older man stood there, his shoulders slightly bent with age. When he stepped forward into the light, Lily and Detective Alan Pierce immediately noticed the uneven way he stood, his weight resting more on one leg than the other. "Mr. Robert Fallon?" Alan asked calmly. The man studied them with cautious eyes before nodding. Alan introduced himself and explained that they had come from Brookdale to ask about something that had happened many years ago. At the mention of the town's name, Fallon's expression changed almost instantly. The calmness in his face faded, replaced by a quiet tension that was impossible to miss. Lily noticed the way his hand slowly tightened against the doorframe, as if an old memory had suddenly returned without warning. Alan spoke gently, explaining that new questions had come up about the murder of Thomas Wheeler and that they believed Fallon might have been near the grocery store the night it happened. For several seconds the man said nothing. The wind moved softly through the trees around the small house, and the silence seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Finally, Fallon stepped back and opened the door wider. "You'd better come in," he said quietly. Inside the house, they sat at a small wooden table while Fallon stared down at his hands. When he finally began to speak, his voice was slow and careful, like someone opening a door he had kept locked for many years. He admitted that he had gone to the grocery store late that night after finishing a delivery route. He said he only meant to speak with Thomas Wheeler about money the store owed him. But the conversation quickly turned into an argument. The situation grew tense, and in a moment of anger he pushed Wheeler. Fallon explained that he never meant to hurt him, but Wheeler fell backward and struck his head against the edge of the counter. Panic took over, and Fallon fled the store without thinking. When he later heard that Daniel Harper had been arrested, fear kept him silent. For 30 years he had lived with that decision, hoping the truth would remain buried in the past. But now, sitting at that quiet table, the story he had carried alone for 3 decades had finally been spoken aloud. The confession changed everything. Within weeks, lawyers and investigators reopened the old case that had once seemed so certain. Robert Fallon's statement was carefully recorded, and the forgotten witness testimony, the flawed timeline, and the missing reports were finally examined together for the first time. What had once looked like a simple story now revealed years of mistakes and assumptions. The court reviewed the evidence quietly but seriously, and before long the conclusion became unavoidable: Daniel Harper had been convicted for a crime he did not commit. One calm autumn morning, 30 years after the night that had changed his life, Daniel Harper walked slowly down a long hallway inside the courthouse. The building felt both strange and familiar to him, like a place from a distant dream. His hair was now gray, and the years had placed gentle lines across his face, but his eyes still carried the quiet patience that had helped him endure 3 decades behind prison walls. Lily Carter and Detective Alan Pierce sat quietly in the courtroom as the judge read the final decision. The conviction was overturned. Daniel Harper was officially declared innocent. For a moment the room remained silent, as if everyone present needed time to understand the weight of those words. Daniel stood very still, listening carefully, almost as though he feared the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. When the hearing ended and he stepped outside the courthouse, the world felt unexpectedly wide and bright. The sky above Brookdale was clear, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees along the street. People passed by without recognizing him, living their ordinary lives, unaware that a man who had lost 30 years was quietly standing among them again. Lily approached him with a warm smile, and Alan followed a few steps behind. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. Daniel looked down the street for a moment before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "I'll start by taking a long walk." There was no anger in his voice, only a calm sense of beginning again. And as he stepped forward onto the sidewalk, the town that had once forgotten him slowly became part of his future once more. The long night of 30 years had finally ended, and the door to a new life had gently opened.